Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our live class today for ELA. Today we're going to start Unit 1. We're going to go over RL 6.1, which is citing textual evidence to back up claims that you have in a text. So our learning targets today, we will discuss and analyze what the text Tanaika says explicitly. Now, I will, or you will, cite evidence from Tanaika explaining what the text says explicitly. So what is text evidence, and what does that mean when we say we're going to cite that text evidence? By citing it, we're just going to point it out. So when we're drawing inferences, which we'll talk about later, or answering questions about a story, we must be able to support the answers to those questions with text evidence. In other words, we have to prove it with details and quotes from the story. So let's look at a short passage that I'll read to you, and then we'll see how that works. This is called Alarming Night, Part 1. Jen Bailey shot up in her bed. She had been awakened by a screeching, deafening sound, a sound that meant no good. She couldn't see any flames, but smoke filled the room. Jen tried to remember everything she learned at the fire safety presentation at school. Get low to the ground, she thought. Lowering herself to the floor, she crouched on her hands and knees and began crawling toward her bedroom door. She tried to cover her mouth and nose with the sleeve of her sweater on her way down the hallway and through the living room to the front door. As soon as Jen got out to the porch, she stood and sprinted toward her family's designated meeting spot, the Riley's mailbox. Luckily, her mom and sister were already there, and Mr. and Mrs. Riley were on the phone with the fire department. For the few minutes that it took for the fire truck to arrive, Jen and her family huddled together anxiously. Even though she knew he was at work, Jen looked around frantically in search of her dad. Sirens could be heard from miles away, and the red flashing lights swung around the corner and onto their street. They watched as the fire truck came to a stop in front of their house. Firefighters bounded hastily out of the truck, completing the task they had been assigned. These heroes unraveled hoses, attached lines, inspected the exterior of the house, and more. This team of first responders worked together like a well-oiled machine. All right, so let's look at some questions to see if we can cite some evidence from the text to back up the answers to those questions. So what was the sound that Jen heard? So in this case, we'll go back to the text. We're going to highlight the evidence that supports our answer in orange. So what was that sound that she heard? So Jen Bailey, this is quoting the text. Jen Bailey shot up in her bed. She had been awakened by a screeching, deafening sound, a sound that meant no good. So what was the sound that she heard? She heard a screeching, deafening sound, a sound that meant no good. So when you ask that question, you go back to the text, and then you search through the text to find evidence for the answer to that question. So let's go to another one. What did Jen do when smoke filled the room? This time we'll highlight the evidence that supports our answer in red. So remember, we go back to the text and we look for evidence in the text to answer this question. So what does the text say specifically that answers this question about the smoke filling the room? So what did she do when the smoke filled the room? Well, you see in red here, she thought to herself, get low to the ground. And then she lowered herself to the floor, and she crouched on her hands and knees and began crawling toward her bedroom door. So when you're asked, what did Jen do when the room was filled with smoke, you go back to the text and you find the answer in the text, and you can see it there in red. So next question, where was the family's designated meeting spot? This time we'll highlight it in blue. And remember, we go back to the text to find the answer in the text. So you can see this is a passage from the text. As soon as Jen got out to the porch, she stood and sprinted toward her family's designated meeting spot, the Riley's mailbox. So where was the family's designated meeting spot? It was the Riley's mailbox. You can see that there in blue. So when you ask this question, you can find the answer directly from the text itself. So let's look at another one real quick. Where was Jen's dad during all of this? We'll highlight this evidence in yellow. Remember, after we read the question, we go back to the text to find our answer. This time, you can see there, even though she knew he was at work, Jen looked around frantically in search of her dad. So what's the answer to the question, where was Jen's dad during all of this? As you see, it says there in the text, he was at work. So what we're going to do is an assignment, and I'll send that out to you all later. We're going to look at this passage called Tanaika. So we'll apply the same concepts about answering questions about the text and finding the answers specifically in the text, and citing that evidence that we found. So I'm going to read this passage for you, and then I will do the first question here just to show you how that works. And then I will send out an assignment for you all to do the rest yourselves. So I'm going to read this passage, and then we'll go back through it and work this one together. So this is called Tanaika, and just the background, it's a story that has to do with the traditions of the Native Americans known as the call. The call are also known as the Kansa. Both names are forms of a word that means people of the south wind. The call originally lived along the Kansas River. As my birthday drew closer, I had awful nightmares about it. I was reaching the age at which all call Indians had to participate in Tanaika. Well, not all calls. Many of the younger families on the reservation were beginning to give up the old customs, but my grandfather, Amos Deerleg, was devoted to tradition. He still wore handmade beaded moccasins instead of shoes and kept his iron gray hair in tight braids. He could speak English, but he spoke it only with white men. With his family, he used a Sioux dialect. Grandfather was one of the last living Indians. He died in 1953 when he was 81, who actually fought against the U.S. cavalry. Not only did he fight, he was wounded in a skirmish at Rose Creek, a famous encounter in which the celebrated call chief Flatnose lost his life. At the time, my grandfather was only 11 years old. 11 was a magic word among the calls. It was the time of Tanaika, the flowering of adulthood. It was the age, my grandfather informed us hundreds of times, when a boy could prove himself to be a warrior and a girl took the first steps to womanhood. I don't want to be a warrior, my cousin Roger Deerleg confided to me. I'm going to become an accountant. None of the other tribes make girls go through the endurance ritual. I complained to my mother. It won't be as bad as you think, Mary, my mother said, ignoring my protests. Once you've gone through it, you'll certainly never forget it. You'll be proud. I even complained to my teacher, Mrs. Richardson, feeling that as a white woman she would side with me. She didn't. All of us have rituals of one kind or another, Mrs. Richardson said. And look at it this way. How many girls have the opportunity to compete on an equal terms with boys? Don't look down on your heritage. Heritage indeed. I had no intention of living on a reservation for the rest of my life. I was a good student. I loved school. My fantasies were about knights in armor and fair ladies in flowing gowns being saved from dragons. It never once occurred to me that being an Indian was exciting, but I've always thought that the call were the originators of the women's liberation movement. No other Indian tribe, and I've spent half a lifetime researching the subject, treated women more equally than the call. Unlike most of the sub-tribes of the Sioux Nation, the call allowed men and women to eat together, and hundreds of years before we were acculturated, a call woman had the right to refuse a prospective husband even if her father arranged the match. The wisest women, generally wisdom was equated with age, often sat in tribal councils. Furthermore, most call legends revolve around Good Woman, a kind of super squaw, a Joan of Arc of the high plains. Good Woman led call warriors into battle after battle, from which they always seemed to emerge victorious. And girls as well as boys were required to undergo Tanaika. The actual ceremony varied from tribe to tribe, but since the Indians' life on the plains was dedicated to survival, Tanaika was a test of survival. Endurance is the loftiest virtue of the Indian, my grandfather explained. To survive, we must endure. When I was a boy, Tanaika was more than the mere symbol it is now. We were painted white with the juice of a sacred herb and sent naked into the wilderness without so much as a knife. We couldn't return until the white had worn off. It wouldn't wash off. It took almost 18 days, and during that time we had to stay alive, trapping food, eating insects. All right, so we'll stop there. Let's go back to the presentation and I'll go through this first example with you. So first we want to read the question. In this question, how does the grandfather look, dress, and act? Cite evidence from the text to back up your claim. So if we read through this passage again, let's see if we can find that answer in the text. As my birthday drew closer, I had awful nightmares about it. I was reaching the age at which all call Indians had to participate in the Tanahika. Well, not all calls. Many of the younger families on the reservation were beginning to give up the old customs. But my grandfather, Amos Deerleg, was devoted to tradition. He still wore handmade beaded moccasins instead of shoes and kept his iron gray hair in tight braids. He could speak English, but he spoke it only with white men. With his family, he used a Sioux dialect. Grandfather was one of the last living Indians. He died in 1953 when he was 81, who actually fought against the U.S. cavalry. Not only did he fight, he was wounded in a skirmish at Rose Creek, a famous encounter in which a celebrated call chief, Flatnose, lost his life. At the time, my grandfather was only 11 years old. So let's look at the question again. How does the grandfather look, dress, and act? Let's cite evidence from the text to back up your claim. So we need to find the grandfather where it talks about the grandfather in the text. So we can see that they start talking about grandfather right here. His name is Amos Deerleg, and he was devoted to tradition. So what does he look like? Well, he still wore handsome beaded moccasins instead of shoes and kept his iron gray hair in tight braids. So does that answer what he looks like, do you think? I think it does. So let's underline that. All right. So what would we do then? Well, we come over here. And then we'll type our answer in. So how does the grandfather look? How does he dress even? He still wore handmade beaded moccasins instead of shoes. And he kept his iron gray hair tight braids. Okay, so you see how we answered that question? We look at the question and then we go back into the text to see if we can find the answer in the text. And when we do, we can underline it, or if you want, you could even go in and draw a circle around it. So we want to be able to see through that circle, so we want to make that transparent. You can make the border color any color that you want. Let's say red, and we can make that a bigger weight so we can see it pretty good. There you go. Either way, how you want to do, you can underline it or you can circle the evidence if it asks you to, whichever way. So we've still got it underlined here. So that's how you do that. So let's look at the next slide. So this one, it's asking us, what is Tanaika? Circle the details that tell you what it is. So we want to go back through and read this passage on this page or listen to the audio from earlier. And then we want to find evidence in the text of the answer to this question. And then we'll do that for the rest of them. So I will send out this assignment. And you all can complete it. And if you have any questions, just please send me a message in Google Classroom. And we will look at this together on Thursday. So I hope you have a good rest of your week until then. And like I said, if you have any questions, please feel free to send me a message. Also, real quick, we're also going to start working on a narrative writing piece. I'll just show you what that looks like. That's here. So we'll be working on narrative. We'll either do a personal narrative or a fictional narrative. Personal narrative, and we'll talk about all this later on Thursday. Personal narrative is when the author writes about an event in his or her life. Fictional narrative is about when an author writes about a story that is made up, basically. So we'll get more into this as we move along next Thursday or this coming Thursday, but I just wanted to give you a heads up